It's time for this week's episode of Brandon Sports Talk, featuring in-depth interviews from those who are trending in the world of athletics. And now, here's the host of Brandon Sports Talk, Brandon Pate.
Welcome back to Brandon Sports Talk. In today's episode, I have the privilege of interviewing the New York Yankees baseball historian, Tony Marrero. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Brandon, now that I'm speaking to you.
Thank you. Can you talk about how you knew that you wanted to get started in working in professional baseball as a sports historian?
I can't hear you, Brandon.
Can you talk about how you knew that you wanted to work in baseball as a baseball historian?
Well, it started way back in about 1949 when I started coming out to the stadium with my dad, who was an usher. And after about 10 years of doing that, he said, "Hey, pal, you're going to have to start earning it." "What do you mean? You want to come to the games?" "Yeah." "Well, you're going to have to start working." "Oh, no, I don't want to work." He said, "Well, then you can't come to the games. Here's an usher's mitt." That gave me an usher, and I became an usher in 1958. So for about 15 years, I was doing an usher while I was working downtown on Wall Street. I was in the Navy for 4 years, and then I got out back down to Wall Street. And then I decided that I would like to continue working in a different capacity at the stadium. And I was asked to join the group and season sales department that Mr. Steinbrenner had come in at that point in time in 1973 in January, and he opened up a group and season sales department. And I was at the base of that. And obviously, the department grew, and it's still in full operation today. But I was looking to do a little bit more than just the group and season sales, and I wanted to get more revenue. So I asked them for permission to do some tours. So I started doing the tours in 1979 on Veterans Day for a large group that came from the Bronx County Courthouse, which is just a few blocks up from Yankee Stadium. And that went pretty well. So I started doing VIP tours for about 5 years until about 1985, when I thought it'd be a good idea to get more revenue by offering it to the schools. So at that point, we were charging like $4 for a teacher and $2 for a child. And it started to really grow. And by 1990, I brought it to the public, and we started bringing it and enlarging this whole uh, tour program. By 1998, Mr. Steinbrenner asked me if I would open up a department exclusively for stadium tours. And that was just a big push for me, because now I was in charge of a department instead of working still with the group and season sales department and doing the tours as an adjunct to it. But that revenue wasn't going into the group and season sales department. Where it was going, it was going into the Yankee Foundation, which is a 501c3 non-for-profit part of the organization that helps school children programs, education, sports, and stuff like that. And it started to expand. And every time, and the boss told me, he said, "Tony, you don't have to report to anybody. Just let me know what you're doing." And I did. I get, and every report, like the tours kept on growing. I would get letters from Mr. Steinbrenner, and that was a big thing, because there was a long history there to get something from the boss. So I felt really good about it. So I opened up tours for the Wounded Warrior Project and the Special Operation Warrior Foundation. The guys and girls that had been on distant shores, getting banged up and coming back home. And I would take them on a regular tour, and then I would take them on the field during batting practice when the batting cage was up, and I would introduce them to ball players. Aaron Judge, Derek Jeter, these guys came over and signed autographs and took pictures for these troopers that were fighting for us and helping strengthen our liberties. So that went pretty well. And then in 2014, Brandon, there was a report that came out from the National Assessment for Educational Progress stating that only 18% of our school children were proficient in social studies. That was alarming. So I thought about this and I said, well, maybe there's something that we could do to introduce American history through the eyes of the national pastime, baseball. Baseball goes back to our early days, when General George Washington uh, advocated his troops to get more involved with leisure and exercise and games of ball. Games of ball, okay? Now, there were folk games, different types of ball was being played centuries ago, even as far as Egypt and games of ball. But now we have folk games that were starting to evolve at the same time. Our country, with the Eli Whitney and the Cotton Gin in 1793, and the folk games of baseball that were marching in lockstep. And then by the time the turn of that century came and the market revolution came, baseball started to expand. So from the agrarian society that the country was used to at that time, started to shift over to a more urban setting. And in 1811, the New York State legislature said that, we wanted to build a grid pattern for people to understand how to get in and out of New York City. So all the avenues and streets were numbered, and it was a great thing. It was a great thing for the developers. So as the game was evolving on the Lower East Side of New York City, and as the developers came, they started taking all that precious land that was being used for fields, okay? And it kept on pushing those fields further and further up to Fourth Avenue and 26th Street when the baseball people said, no, we can't do this anymore. So they jumped over to Elysian Field in New Jersey. So that was how the game evolved here in New York. But what was going on at that time? So from the market revolution, the Erie Canal in 1825, and then organized baseball came in the 1930s. And I think one of the first teams was a team from Philadelphia in 1831. It was organized, but it didn't have rules. It wasn't until 1837 that the New York Gothams had laid down the first set of rules for the game. The Knickerbockers, which came about in 1845, actually were a spinoff of the Gothams, and they laid rules down, which is now called the New York game. So you had the Olympic ball games of Philadelphia, you had the Massachusetts games of town ball, and now you have the New York game. New York games started to become more popular because the city was growing by leaps and bounds at the time. In 1844, we had the telegraph that was invented, and that was able to spread the game beyond the city and further west and south. And then Manifest Destiny, when President Polk determined that he wanted to go from sea to shining sea with the country. Don't forget that the western part of the United States up until 1845 was basically east of the Mississippi River. Now he's encouraging people to go to the west. And they had all these different trails, the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and so on and so forth, that were taking people out to the west. But what they were doing during their downtime was giving them an opportunity to have recreation and games of ball. And the game that they were bringing was the New York game. So by 1849, with the gold rush, some of the New York Knickerbockers at that time said, we got to make some more money. So a few of them had it up and went out west, taking the New York game. By 1851, the San Francisco Knickerbockers evolved, taking their name from the Knickerbockers of New York because of the guys that went out there that were former New York Knicks. Then we had the Civil War. The Civil War was a very important part of the development of the country. The unification was so important that uh, during the course of the war, as some of the northern troops were taken prisoners in southern camps, during recreation, they were playing the game of baseball, the New York game. And with that, they were getting more and more involved with their captors, the southern jail people and everything like that. So by the end of the Civil War, one of the main parts of the unification of the country. Now, don't forget, we're coming into a bad time because not everybody really wanted the unification, especially in the South. And President Lincoln was assassinated. Now you had the Reconstruction era where a lot of people were reverting to Southern stuff. Eventually, these other organizations, the Ku Klux Klan and other, evolved from that. But what was happening right after the war, that the North was playing the South, and they were interacting with through the game of baseball. So that was one of the ways that it spread. By 1869, it was no longer an amateur sport. In 1869, the Cincinnati Red Stockings became the first all-paid professional team, and they did a cross-country trip, winning 69 games and losing none. And that was about the same time that the Transcontinental Railroad was growing. So you see how New York was parallel, the baseball game was parallel with American history. And moving on forward into the Gilded Age and how the robber barons, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, J.P. Morgan, and these guys were leading the way as far as opening up this Gilded Age where money was buying everything, and there was a big, massive immigration at that point in time, and a lot of people that were coming into the United States were living under really squalid conditions. And if you ever really want to get an idea of how these immigrants lived, they were sort of like slaves underneath the thumb of these big money guys. And the name of the book was by Jacob Riis. It was called How the Other Half Lives. And it'll give you a really clear idea of what it was like for these immigrants and how they had to live until about 1896 when the progressive era came about. So the game started to change a little bit more at that time. But keep in mind that as far as those robber barons were concerned, the owners weren't too far away from the robber barons because the reserve clause had come in. Prior to that, you had what they were calling hippodroming. And hippodroming was basically how players would jump their contracts during the course of the season for a better opportunity and more money. And this was hurting the owners because they couldn't replace that talent. So they designed the reserve clause in 1888, and from that and up until 1976, the owners treated the players like chattel until Marvin Miller came along in the 1960s, and he helped form the Major League Baseball Players Association. And so by 1976, the players had formed their union, and they started to get involved with free agency. And there was an arbitrator by the name of Peter Seitz who had respect for the whole case, and he voted in favor of the players with this free agency clause, where after a year the players could go out and seek their own contracts. So that's basically how that all worked. And going back into the beginning of the 20th century, how baseball came to New York, a guy by the name of John McGraw, who was a great manager ultimately. And he was a ball player for the Baltimore Orioles at that time. And the Baltimore Orioles were winning everything in the 1890s. And they had these very harsh tactics of how to win. They would trip guys, they would bump them, they would pull their belts and do all these crazy things to help them win. It was a dirty game of baseball, is what it was. So now he came from Tuxedo, New York. So this guy by the name of Van Johnson, who was the president of the Western Association, which was a very successful minor league in the 1890s, turned and made them a professional team in 1900. And the American League was born in 1901 as a result of Ben Johnson and all his doings. Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, and Washington. But there was no New York. That didn't work too well. So McGraw sorely wanted to be part of a New York team, but he was such a bad dude that Ben Johnson constantly berated him. Ben Johnson was an editor of the Cincinnati Gazette, and he would write these vitriolic articles on John McGraw. And it was crazy that McGraw, now he wants to be part of Ben Johnson, and Ben Johnson said, this is not happening. So what happened was the McGraw was with the Baltimore team at the time of the opening of the American League. Ben Johnson knew that he couldn't get this league off the ground unless he had New York. So he rejected McGraw's possibility of coming into New York. So he went to the New York Giants. He actually left the team. He jumped his team in July of 1902 and went to the New York Giants because of Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall played a big part of all of this that's going on, all the shenanigans that were going on in the political arena evolved from Tammany Hall, which was a big factor in gambling and corruption in the game of baseball. And it reflects a little bit on what we're doing today. We sort of opened the door for gambling. All over the advertisements are gambling ideas and everything like that. And I that's what it is. That's what it is. So what happened was in 1902, there was another gentleman who was a pretty powerful guy, Big Jim, and in Tammany Hall, and he was able to wrestle some of the other factions in Tammany Hall and get a New York entry. And that's when the New York Highlanders came about in 1903, also to be called the New York Yankees intermittently up until 1913, when the Yankees, the New York team was playing in the Polo Ground. First, they played in Hilltop Park. Then they went to the Polo Grounds under John McGraw's influence. How that happened, McGraw had seen that they weren't doing too well and everything, and he wanted to put out an olive branch, so he invited them to come to the Polo Grounds. So the Yankees, now they're being called the Yankees more often, not officially. The still name is not official, okay, until this day, that it's the New York Yankees, but that is the name that it goes by. There was never an official document stating that this is the New York Yankees, okay? So from 1913 until 1922, the Yankees were playing in the Polo Grounds under the auspices of the New York Giants, whose home field it was. Babe Ruth comes along in 1919. The game had been going through that dead ball era. Babe Ruth comes and he socks 29 home runs as he comes to the New York Yankees, being purchased from the Boston Red Sox, which was noted as the greatest deal of the 20th century, one of the greatest deals of the 20th century, I should say. And the cost of $125,000, he becomes a New York Yankee, and he changes the game forever. So from that day that he started playing for the New York Yankees in 1920, he hit 54 home runs. The record that he had set the year before when he was in Boston was 29 home runs. So he eclipsed that by 25 home runs. But you got to get a grip on what was going on in that era. You had the Spanish flu, millions of people that died of the flu. You had the women's 18th and 19th Amendments that gave them freedom of speech and voting rights and stuff like that. You had World War I in 1917. And these things were drawing away from the game on top of the fact that they were only playing with one ball. And that's why it was called, excuse me, that's why it was called the dead ball era. Because they only used one baseball. If it went into the stands, they retrieved it and continued playing. And that's why only 25 home runs led the league at that point in time. So now they started with the clean baseballs in 1920. And then Babe Ruth, took full advantage of that. And he led the charge of this great roaring 20s. Automobiles, radio come into the scene, and the game of baseball starts to really expand, so much so that the Yankees get involved in postseason play for the first time, only to lose to the New York Giants in the World Series in 1921 and 1922. But there was a guy by the name of Jacob Rubert, who was the owner of one of the owners of the Yankees, along with Tillinghast Lumber in Houston, in the when they bought it from the earlier Yankee owners, Frank Farrell and Bill Bevery, who was the most corrupt police commissioner of the time, who sold it to the Yankees. Now, his dream was to have his own ballpark, and now, for a cost of $2.4 million, you can't even get a good shortstop for that nowadays. Okay, he had built Yankee Stadium in 1923. Yankee Stadium went on to become the most famous outdoor arena in our country. Okay, soccer, boxing, circuses, rodeos, Negro baseball, women's professional baseball exhibition games, and 27 championships. Huh. That was a lot. That was a lot. So that's pretty much the story of how the game evolved here in New York, and then even until today, the signs of them coming back to their old form. In these first few days, they took a big series from their nemesis, the Houston Astros, winning 4 games down there and sort of turning the tables, which belonged to the Houston Astros for the last 4 years. They were kicking their butts, and then finally, the Yankees turned it around over the opening of the baseball season, and moving forward, they even beat Arizona last night. So that pretty much brings it up to where we are today. And my whole thing is that I came to the point of retiring after, in 2014, as I mentioned, that these kids were struggling, and I designed this program. I didn't want to abandon it. And what I did was write a book. It's called Baseball, the New York Game, and subtitled How the National Pastime Parallels U.S. History. And it's on Amazon. If you want to get it, that's a good idea. I'd love to see that happening. And if you have any other, questions or anything, you want to get in touch with me, I'm at yanktony@gmail.com. Be more than happy to talk to you about it.
Of course, what is your book about?
It's about baseball and the growth of the popular culture in our country. So keep in mind that all of the historical facts that I was bringing to you before was being paralleled by the game of baseball and how they interacted. It was a symbiotic relationship. Baseball relied on American history and the popular culture, and popular culture became what was known as baseball. Excuse me. I'm going to have to get back to you. So that's, I think that answered your question, didn't it?
During your time, what was it like covering the World Series?
I didn't cover it. I was there. I enjoyed it. I participated in some of the events, that were on the field because we had interacting departments, and my department used to help out the community relations and other departments. As for example, we had pregame ceremonies, we had to bring bands on the field and everything. It was my guys that helped the promotions department bring these bands on the field. And I'll never forget one time after 9/11, I was coming off the field after taking a band out to center field, and I was leaving by way of the warning track. And I looked over to my left by the Yankee dugout, and I see this lady, and he says, "Oh my God, that's Lisa Beamer." Do you remember the name Beamer? Todd Beamer?
Mhm.
Todd Beamer was one of the flight of people that were on Flight 93 that was going towards Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And then they had the terrorists on the plane that rerouted it, and they were coming back to Washington to nail the White House or the Capitol. But he had a bunch of guys there, and he was speaking to his wife, and the telephone operator heard him say the word, "Let's roll." Oh my God. What they did was they stopped the terrorists and they crashed the plane. Everybody was killed on the plane, but the plane did not hit Washington. And to see Lisa Beamer there, I had to walk over to her, and I with a little trepidation because I didn't know. I see this big smile on her face, and she had her two kids with her. It was it was very touching, to say the least. I was overwhelmed by her greeting, you know. Um, but we used to interact with the other departments in pregame ceremonies and stuff like that.
Of course, what were some of your favorite memories and moments getting to see the World Series?
My favorite moments, I think there were a lot of them. Um, Mariano Rivera, Andy Pettit in the snow. Um, Let me say, Mickey Mantle going back into the 50s, the home runs. Another memory is Johnny Padres in 1955 when he beat the Yankees. That's one thing that'll stick in my head forever. It was the first time that Brooklyn ever beat us. And don't forget that period between 1947 and 1957. Either the Yankees, Giants, and Dodgers were involved in the World Series, other than 1948. And it was mostly the Yankees and Dodgers. And I'll never forget. You asked me for favorite moments and everything, things that stick in my head. My mom came from Brooklyn, so every time the holidays would come around, we would share them with my Bronx people from my father's side, with the Brooklyn people from my mother's side. From time to time, we would go to Brooklyn. And after the World Series in those years, you know, I would walk in, and as soon as I walked in, I would hear my Uncle Tommy, "The Yankees stink." What do you mean the Yankees stink? And I would listen to this until I was 11 years old in 1953. I did my wage, do the math, okay? And in 1953, we went to Brooklyn. And as soon as I walked in the door, I heard that same chant, "The Yankees stink." I said, "What do you mean we stink? We won 4 consecutive World Series, 5 consecutive World Series, and we beat the Dodgers 3 times in the World Series. What are you talking about?" So the World Series with the Dodgers and some of the home runs, Yogi and Mickey, Johnny, there were there were a lot of great moments that. And here's a real big one. 1956, the fifth game of the World Series. Don Larson pitches a perfect game. Okay, the only perfect game in World Series history. And at that time, the people were allowed to leave by way of the field. So what would happen was, as soon as the game was over, there were ushers that were asked to go out and meet Don Larson. So my father was one of the ushers. So when I see the picture of Yogi jumping into Larson's arms and everything, my father was right there with his usher's hat and everything. So when he came, so I was in school that time, at that point in time, because I was still in school, obviously. And when he came home, I said, "Did you see that, Dad? Did you see that game?" He said, "Yeah, I was there." He said, "I was the first one out to Don Lawson when Yogi jumped on him." Oh my God! So every time I see that clip, I'm telling you, Brandon, is such a charge I get. It brings back fond memories, you know, of my dad, who's passed away since then. But um, that would be a highlight. That would be one of the highlights of the World Series in '56, and it helped us get even with the Dodgers, who won their first one the year before. And Pete Hamill, the famous author, said it was like for VJ Day, your birthday, and New Year's Eve all together in Brooklyn. They were going crazy out there. And don't forget, Brooklyn had a culture unto itself. Brooklyn people loved their Dodgers, and the Dodgers loved Brooklyn. Some of them lived right outside of the ballpark. They lived in Bedford and around that area, so they were part of the community. And they also had things like Hilda Chester's cowbell. She used to be ringing the bell all game long, which was crazy. The Dodgers Symphony. There were three guys that would walk around playing some instruments, and every time the umpires made a bad call, they would play three blind mice, and the umpires used to go nuts, and they try to get them thrown out and everything like that. Hilda, Happy Felton's Knot Hole Gang, where some of the people, some of the kids were able to go on the field during batting practice and play catch with the ball players. So Brooklyn had a character unto itself. And I don't think that they really wanted to join the New York City in 1899 when it was consolidated with the five boroughs. There were some people, because there was always a competition between Brooklyn, which was a city unto itself from 1834 on forward, until it was consolidated into the city in 1899 with Queens, Manhattan, Bronx, and Staten Island. So you got your five boroughs now, but there were some people in Brooklyn that didn't want to be part of this, but they realized that, oh, we're going to get police, fire, sanitation. Yeah, we got to go that way. But there was still some people, even into the 40s and 50s, that had that thing about Brooklyn and New York. Even till today, Brooklyn is hot. The real estate going on down there is just off the charts. But New York is also getting more and more popular. It became the epicenter of baseball at that point.
What advice would you give those people looking to become baseball historians like yourself?
Brandon, could you repeat that?
What advice would you give those people out there looking to become baseball historians like yourself?
Well, it's about passion. You have to have a passion for it. I grew up with it. It was in my DNA. And as I got more and more involved with it, it firmly entrenched the game into my into my well-being and even the tours. So even though I left the Yankees in 2018, I should say, 2018, I came back to the Bronx, and one of my favorite places in the Bronx as I was growing up was Botanical Gardens. So now I'm doing tours of Botanical Gardens as a volunteer. But I still go around talking about baseball and bringing the book to different organizations and everything, Con Edison, and organizations that request me to come out there and speak to them.
That's great advice. Where can my listeners find you at on social media?
Brandon, I didn't hear you.
Where can my listeners find you at on social media?
You can find me on social media, just TonyMorante.com.
Thank you again, Tony Morante, for your interview, and best luck in your future.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. You can find Brandon Sports Talk on Instagram at Brandon Sports Talk, Twitter at Talk_Brandon, and you can find me on YouTube at Brandon Sports Talk. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you again, Tony Morante, for your interview, and best luck in your future.
It was fun. It was a lot of fun, and bringing back my memories and stuff like that. I really enjoyed being part of your program, and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you.
You've been watching Brandon Sports Talk. Please feel free to like, share, and subscribe to Brandon Sports Talk on social media, and on YouTube.